The avoidant person expected you to fight back when their patterns hurt you, expected you to argue about their withdrawal, or to demand explanations for their hot and cold behavior, or to pursue them when they created distance, or to become emotional and reactive in ways that would validate their defensive narratives about relationships being too difficult or about you being too needy or too demanding. But instead of fighting, instead of arguing, instead of pursuing, instead of becoming the emotional person they expected and perhaps unconsciously wanted you to become, you simply left, calmly, decisively, with dignity intact, removing yourself from situation that wasn't serving you, without the drama or the emotional reaction they were braced for and prepared to handle. And this unexpected response, your departure instead of your fight, absolutely broke them in ways that fighting never could have broken them, shattered their psychological framework in ways that pursuing them never would have shattered it, destroyed their self-image and their defensive narratives in ways that emotional reactivity would have validated rather than demolished. The avoidance defensive system is built to handle conflict, built to manage pursuit, built to deal with emotional reactions. They expect anger, and they can dismiss it as you being too sensitive. They expect demands, and they can frame those as you being too needy. They expect pursuit, and they can use that to validate their attractiveness while maintaining their distance. They expect fighting, and they can point to the fighting as evidence that the relationship was problematic and that leaving was the right choice. Every defensive narrative they have, every story they tell themselves about why their patterns are justified and why relationship didn't work, requires your cooperation through fighting back or pursuing or becoming emotionally reactive in ways that give them ammunition to use against you and against the relationship. But you didn't cooperate. You didn't provide the expected response. You didn't fight back or pursue or become the dramatic emotional person their defensive system was prepared to dismiss. Instead, you withdrew your presence entirely, removed yourself with calm finality, demonstrated through your departure that you valued yourself too much to fight for someone who wasn't fighting for the relationship, showed through your silence and your absence that you were done in ways that no amount of fighting or pursuing would have communicated. This broke them because it denied them every defensive narrative they rely on. They couldn't tell themselves you were too emotional because you were remarkably composed, couldn't tell themselves you were too needy because you demonstrated complete self-sufficiency by leaving, couldn't tell themselves relationship was too difficult because you handled the ending with ease and dignity, couldn't tell themselves you'd always be there because you proved definitively that you couldn't maintain their usual stories about why they push people away, because your departure without fighting proved the problem was them and their patterns rather than relationship dynamics or your alleged inadequacies. Why your departure, instead of fighting, shattered their entire framework. The avoidant person's psychological framework and defensive system are built on specific expectations about how people respond to their patterns, and your choice to leave rather than to fight violated these expectations so completely that it shattered the entire structure they use to understand relationships and to protect themselves. Understanding why departure breaks them more than fighting reveals both their psychological organization and the power of your unexpected response. Your departure shattered their framework because they expected your investment in the relationship to make you fight for it, and your leaving proved they'd fundamentally misread your attachment and your priorities. The avoidant observed your investment throughout the relationship, your patience with their patterns, your efforts to understand them, your willingness to work through difficulties, your care and attention. They interpreted this investment as evidence that you were deeply attached, that you needed them, that you'd do anything to maintain the relationship, including fighting indefinitely for their attention and their commitment. This interpretation made them feel safe, that you'd always be there, always be pursuing, always be trying. Your departure shattered this belief by proving your investment had limits, that your attachment to them was less powerful than your attachment to your own well-being and dignity, that you could walk away when relationships stopped serving you despite all the effort you'd invested. This forced them to recognize they'd misread the entire dynamic and had falsely believed they had more power and more control than they actually had. Your departure shattered their framework because fighting would have given them ammunition to justify their patterns, but leaving gave them nothing to hide behind. The avoidance defensive narratives require your cooperation. They need you to be emotional so they can frame you as unstable. They need you to demand so they can frame you as needy. They need you to argue so they can frame the relationship as too conflictual. Fighting would have provided the evidence they needed to tell themselves and others that the relationship was problematic, that you were difficult, that their leaving or their patterns were justified responses to your behavior. But your calm departure provided no such evidence. You weren't emotional, you were composed. You weren't demanding, you were self-sufficient. You weren't creating conflict, you were ending it through dignified exit. This left them with no defensive narrative to justify their patterns. They couldn't blame you for the ending, couldn't point to your behavior as problem, couldn't use your reaction as evidence of anything except your strength and your self-respect. Your departure shattered their framework because they expected pursuit when they withdrew, and your refusal to pursue broke the dance their patterns depend on. The avoidance patterns function within specific relational dynamic. They withdraw, you pursue. They create distance, you try to close it. They go cold. You work to restore warmth. This pursuit-withdrawal dynamic is what makes their patterns sustainable. Your pursuit validates their desirability while allowing them to maintain control through distance. Your efforts to close distance allow them to regulate intimacy. By controlling when distance closes, your work to restore warmth means they never have to be vulnerable by initiating warmth themselves. Your departure destroyed this entire dynamic. You didn't pursue when they withdrew, you withdrew further. You didn't try to close distance, you increased it permanently. You didn't work to restore warmth, you went cold yourself. This complete reversal of expected pattern left them without familiar framework for managing the relationship dynamic, without the pursuit that made their withdrawal sustainable, without the dance they knew how to perform. Your departure shattered their framework because it placed them in position of being the one who lost something rather than being the one who left, reversing power dynamic they thought they controlled. The avoidance sense of control and safety comes from being the one who leaves first, the one who creates distance, the one who has the option to stay or go. They felt powerful because they believed they were the one determining the relationship's trajectory, the one deciding whether it continued or ended, the one with the ultimate control. Your departure reversed this completely. You were the one who left. You were the one who decided it was over. You were the one who had the power. They're now in position of being the one who was left, the one who lost something, the one who didn't have control over the outcome. This reversal is deeply destabilizing because it places them in the vulnerable position they've spent their life avoiding, forces them to feel the abandonment and powerlessness they've been defending against, shatters their belief that they controlled the dynamic. Your departure shattered their framework because leaving demonstrated strength they didn't think you possessed, forcing revision of their entire understanding of who you were. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant likely underestimated you. They saw your patience as weakness, your understanding as inability to leave, your investment as dependency. They constructed image of you as person who needed them more than they needed you, person who would tolerate their patterns indefinitely, because you lacked options or self-worth to leave. Your departure destroyed this image completely. Leaving demonstrated profound strength. Strength to choose yourself over relationship. Strength to walk away from someone you cared about when treatment became unacceptable. Strength to enforce boundaries with finality. This revelation that you were far stronger than they believed forced complete revision of their understanding of who you were, shattered their assumptions about the power dynamics, proved their red, but on you was fundamentally wrong in ways that destabilized their confidence in their own perceptions. Your departure shattered their framework because it communicated finality that fighting never could communicate, removing hope or ambiguity they could hide in. When people fight, there's implicit message that relationship still matters enough to fight for. That door is still open. That reconciliation is possible after the anger passes. The avoidant could handle fighting because fighting leaves things ambiguous, leaves possibility, leaves hope that they could return if they wanted. But your departure communicated something entirely different. Finality. You weren't fighting for the relationship. You were ending it. You weren't angry about their behavior. You were done with it. You weren't leaving door open for reconciliation. You were closing it definitively. This finality is what broke them because it eliminated the safety net they didn't realize they were relying on, the unconscious assumption that you'd always be available if they decided they wanted you back, the hidden hope that the relationship could be restored when they were ready. Your departure proved this assumption false and removed this safety net permanently. Your departure shattered their framework because it forced them to sit with complete responsibility for the ending, without ability to distribute blame through pointing to your behavior during fights. When relationships end through fighting, there's usually shared responsibility. Both people said hurtful things. Both people contributed to the conflict. Both people can point to the other's behavior as problematic. The avoidant could use this shared responsibility to avoid full accountability, to tell themselves and others that the relationship didn't work because of incompatibility or because of problems both people contributed to. But your departure eliminated this possibility. You didn't fight. You didn't say hurtful things. You didn't create conflict. You simply left because their patterns made staying untenable. This leaves them holding complete responsibility. The relationship ended because of their patterns, because of their treatment of you, because of their inability to show up. There's no shared blame to hide in, no way to distribute responsibility, no your behavior during fights to point to as justification for the ending. This complete accountability is devastating to their self-image and to their defensive narratives. The specific ways leaving broke them more than conflict ever could. The avoidant person's experience of being broken by your departure, rather than by fighting, manifests in specific forms of psychological devastation that conflict would not have created. Understanding these specific ways leaving broke them reveals both the power of your choice and the unique impact of dignified departure versus emotional fighting. Leaving broke them by denying them the emotional reaction they were psychologically prepared to defend against, leaving them with no target for their defensive strategies. The avoidance defenses are built to handle emotion. They can dismiss anger, can rationalize your pain, can justify themselves against your accusations. These defenses activate automatically when faced with emotional reaction, providing psychological protection through minimization and rationalization. But your departure provided no emotion to defend against. You weren't angry in ways they could dismiss. You weren't hurt in ways they could rationalize. You weren't accusing them of things they could justify themselves against. Your calm, composed departure left their defensive strategies with nothing to work on, no emotional reaction to minimize or rationalize away. This left them psychologically vulnerable in ways emotional fighting never would have created, because their usual defenses couldn't activate without emotional target, leaving them directly exposed to reality of the loss without psychological buffers. Leaving broke them by proving you were more self-sufficient and less attached than they believed, destroying their sense of security that you'd always be available. The avoidant felt secure throughout the relationship, believing you needed them, believing your attachment to them was stronger than your self-respect, believing you'd tolerate their patterns indefinitely because you couldn't imagine being without them. Your leaving shattered this security by proving you didn't need them the way they thought. Proving your self-sufficiency was greater than your attachment to them. Proving you could not only imagine being without them, but could actually choose being without them over continuing to accept their patterns. This revelation destroyed their sense of security about your availability and forced recognition that they'd taken you for granted based on completely false assumptions about your needs and your strength. Leaving broke them by creating immediate and undeniable consequences for their patterns in ways that fighting never created. When you fought with them about their patterns, the consequences were abstract or future-oriented. You were upset, but still there. You were unhappy, but still trying. You were expressing that their behavior had to change, but giving them more time to change it. These abstract consequences allowed them to continue their patterns without facing real costs. But your leaving created immediate concrete consequence. You were gone. The consequence wasn't future possibility, but was present reality. They didn't have more time to work on their patterns, more chances to do better, more opportunities to change. The consequence was already here, already happening, already irreversible. This immediacy and concreteness of consequence was far more impactful than abstract future consequences threatened during fights. Leaving broke them by forcing them to experience the abandonment and loss they'd spent their entire life defending against, with no way to control or prevent it. The avoidant's entire defensive structure is built to prevent abandonment. They leave first, they control distance, they prevent deep attachment that would make loss painful. But your leaving forced them to experience exactly what they've been defending against. They were left, they didn't control it, they were attached enough that it hurt. The abandonment they've feared their entire life, the loss they've organized their defenses to prevent, happened anyway despite all their strategies. This forced experience of their core fear is devastating in ways fighting would never be, because fighting doesn't trigger the core. Abandonment wound, the way being left, triggers it. Leaving broke them by eliminating their option to return when ready, removing control they didn't realize they needed for psychological safety. Throughout the relationship and during previous withdrawals, the avoidant maintained psychological safety through belief that they could return when ready, that you'd be there when they decided they wanted connection, that they controlled whether and when the relationship continued. Your leaving eliminated this option. You weren't there to return to. The door was closed. They couldn't decide when they wanted to reconnect because reconnection wasn't available. This loss of control, this removal of the return option they didn't realize they were relying on for psychological safety, created panic and broke them in ways that fighting would never have created, because fighting leaves the return option open while leaving, closes it definitively. Leaving broke them by creating permanent hole in their life that fighting never would have created, because fighting keeps you present even while in conflict. When you fought, you were still there, still in their life, still part of their daily existence, still someone they saw and interacted with, even if the interactions were conflictual. Your presence, even in conflict, was familiar and was something their life was organized around. But your leaving created absence. You were gone from their daily life, gone from their routine, gone from their existence. This absence created permanent hole that they noticed constantly, in moments when they'd usually talk to you, in situations where they'd share with you, in the general structure of their days that used to include you. This constant awareness of absence is far more devastating than the temporary unpleasantness of fighting, because absence is permanent reminder of what's lost, while fighting is temporary state that ends when conflict resolves. Leaving broke them by providing comparison point between life with you and life without you that proved they were worse off without you. While you were present, even during fights, the avoidant couldn't clearly compare life with you versus life without you. They could focus on difficulties of the relationship, on discomforts your presence created, on what they thought they were sacrificing to be with you. But your leaving created stark comparison. Life with you, with all its difficulties, versus life without you, with all its emptiness. This comparison proved, definitively, that life with you was better, that the difficulties they focused on were minor compared to the loss of what you provided, that they were objectively worse off without you, despite their belief that distance would bring relief. This comparison-based proof of their mistake is more powerful than anything that could be communicated through fighting, because it's experiential reality rather than abstract argument. Leaving broke them by demonstrating that you valued yourself more than you valued being with them, which is blow to their ego that fighting never delivers. Fighting communicates that you care enough to fight, that you want things to work, that you value the relationship enough to struggle for it. This validates the avoidant's importance and their desirability. You're fighting for them, working for their attention, trying to maintain connection with them. But leaving communicates something entirely different. You value yourself more than you value being with them. You'd rather be alone than be with them under current conditions. You prioritize your dignity and your well-being over having them in your life. This is a profound blow to their ego because it proves they weren't important enough to keep you, weren't valuable enough to make you tolerate their patterns, weren't desirable enough to override your self-respect. This ego injury is far more painful than anything that happens during fighting, because fighting validates their importance, while leaving proves their importance to you was conditional and that those conditions were not met. How your dignified exit destroyed their psychological defenses and self-image. The avoidant person's defensive system and self-image were specifically destroyed by the dignified nature of your exit, by the composure and self-respect you demonstrated in leaving. Understanding how your dignity in departure created unique damage reveals why the manner of your leaving mattered as much as the fact of your leaving. Your dignified exit destroyed their defense of blaming you for relationship problems, because your composure provided no evidence of the emotional instability or unreasonable demands they'd need to blame you. The avoidant's primary defensive strategy when relationships end is to blame the other person. You were too emotional, too demanding, too needy, too difficult. This blame shifting protects their self-image by making the other person the problem rather than their patterns being the problem. But your dignified exit provided no material for this defense. You weren't too emotional. You were remarkably composed. You weren't too demanding. You simply had standards they couldn't meet. You weren't too needy. You demonstrated complete self-sufficiency by leaving. You weren't too difficult. You handled the ending with ease and grace. This lack of evidence for their usual blame shifting left them unable to protect themselves through their primary defense, forcing them to sit with the reality that the problem was their patterns rather than your inadequacies. Your dignified exit destroyed their defense of minimizing your importance by proving through your calm departure that you were strong enough to leave someone who mattered to you. The avoidant minimizes people's importance as defensive strategy. If you didn't matter that much, then losing you isn't that significant. Then their patterns didn't destroy something valuable. But your dignified exit made this minimization impossible. Leaving someone calmly and with dignity when you've been invested in them requires profound strength. It means you matter to them enough that leaving is difficult, but their self-respect matters more. This combination of evident investment plus ability to leave proves you were both important to yourself and strong enough to choose yourself over a relationship that wasn't serving you. This makes it impossible for them to minimize your importance because your strength in leaving actually highlights how much you must have mattered for walking away to require that level of strength. Your dignified exit destroyed their defense of believing they didn't really hurt you or that your pain wasn't serious. The avoidant protects themselves from guilt by minimizing the harm they cause, telling themselves you're too sensitive, that you'll get over it, that your pain isn't that serious or is exaggerated. But your dignified exit destroyed this defense because people who aren't genuinely hurt don't leave with the finality you demonstrated. Your departure without drama or emotional display proves you were hurt seriously enough that staying was no longer tolerable, that the pain was profound enough to outweigh your investment in the relationship, that the harm was severe enough to require complete removal. This forces them to confront that they hurt you deeply, that the harm was real and serious, that your pain was sufficient to drive you away permanently. This guilt is undefended and unavoidable in ways it wouldn't be if you left emotionally, because emotional exits can be minimized as overreaction, while dignified exits cannot be minimized without obvious dishonesty. Your dignified exit destroyed their self-image as person in control of relationship dynamics by proving they'd lost control to someone they'd underestimated. The avoidant maintains self-image as person who controls relationships, who decides whether relationships continue, who determines the distance, who has the power. They believed they were in control with you, that they determined the relationship's trajectory. Your dignified exit shattered this self-image by proving they never had the control they thought they had. You determined the relationship ended. You decided the terms. You had the power to leave when you chose to leave. And perhaps most damaging to their self-image, you had this power because you were stronger and more self-possessed than they realized. They'd underestimated you, had thought you lacked capacity to leave, had believed they controlled the dynamic, and your exit proved they were wrong on all counts. This revelation that they weren't in control and that they fundamentally misread the situation destroys their self-image as perceptive person who understands and controls relationship dynamics. Your dignified exit destroyed their self-image as decent person whose patterns are just self-protection by forcing them to see their behavior as cruel enough to drive away someone gracious. The avoidant tells themselves they're a decent person whose patterns are unfortunate but understandable, whose self-protection is justified, whose behavior might be difficult but isn't cruel or harmful. But your dignified exit forces different understanding. You were patient, understanding, gracious in how you handled their patterns. You gave chances, created safety, accepted them with their limitations. You were a model of kindness and maturity. And despite all this graciousness, their patterns were harmful enough, their treatment was poor enough, that you still had to leave for your own protection. This proves their behavior wasn't just self-protection or unfortunate patterns, but was actually harmful enough to drive away someone who approached them with extraordinary grace. This forces confrontation with their behavior being not just difficult, but cruel, not just self-protective, but destructive, challenging their self-image as decent person in ways that create profound shame. Your dignified exit destroyed their defensive belief that you needed them more than they needed you by proving the opposite through your strength in leaving. The avoidant protected themselves throughout the relationship by believing power dynamic favored them. You needed them more, you were more attached, you would suffer more from loss. This belief made them feel safe, that you'd never leave, that they had the upper hand, that they were the more valuable party. Your dignified exit inverted this understanding completely. You proved you didn't need them more. You could leave cleanly and create good life without them. You proved you weren't more attached. Your attachment to your own well-being was stronger than your attachment to them. You proved you wouldn't suffer more. You were clearly thriving, or at minimum surviving well, while they were destroyed. This inversion forces recognition that they needed you more than you needed them, that they were more attached, that they're suffering more from the loss, completely destroying the defensive belief that gave them sense of security. Your dignified exit destroyed their defensive narrative about avoidant patterns being sustainable lifestyle by proving their patterns cost them someone irreplaceable. The avoidant tells themselves their patterns are a viable way to live, that independence is sustainable, that keeping people at distance protects them without real cost, that their defensive strategies work to keep them safe without destroying what matters. Your dignified exit destroys this narrative by proving the cost is real and is catastrophic. Their patterns didn't protect them. They destroyed relationship with someone irreplaceable. Their independence isn't sustainable. It's lonely isolation. Their defensive strategies didn't keep them safe. They created the devastating loss they were meant to prevent. The dignified nature of your exit makes this lesson undeniable, because you weren't a person who left in dramatic emotional way that they could dismiss as incompatible. You were a person who left with dignity and strength, person whose exit proves their patterns don't work and are destroying their chances for happiness rather than protecting them. What's your choice to leave, rather than fight, means for your power and freedom. The avoidant person's devastation at your choice to leave, rather than fight, has specific implications for your own power, your dignity, and your path forward. Understanding what your choice means ensures you recognize the strength of your position and the freedom your departure created for you. Your choice to leave rather than fight means you maintained your dignity and self-respect by refusing to beg for treatment you deserve as baseline. Fighting for someone's consistent presence, arguing about whether your needs are legitimate, pursuing someone who withdraws from you. All of these create dynamic where you're begging for what should be freely given, where you're defending your worth to someone who should recognize it without defense, where you're trying to convince someone to treat you well, when treating you well should be their desire, not your accomplishment. By leaving rather than fighting, you maintained your dignity by refusing to participate in this dynamic. You demonstrated that your worth is not up for debate, that consistent respectful treatment is non-negotiable, baseline, not goal to be achieved through fighting, that you'd rather be alone than be in relationship where you have to fight for basic decency. Your choice to leave means you demonstrated strength that commands respect and that elevates you in their mind permanently. The avoidant might not have respected you fully while you were fighting or pursuing because these behaviors seemed like weakness or desperation to their wounded perception. But leaving, especially leaving with dignity and composure, commands respect even from defended person because it demonstrates profound strength. Strength to choose yourself, strength to walk away from something you invested in, strength to enforce boundaries with finality. This demonstration of strength permanently elevates you in their mind. You're no longer a person they could take for granted or person they believed needed them. You're a person who was strong enough to leave them, person whose strength they underestimated, person who commands respect through the power of their dignified exit. Your choice to leave means you're free from the exhausting cycle of pursuit and withdrawal that characterizes relationships where you fight for avoidance attention, fighting for avoidance attention, pursuing when they withdraw, working to maintain connection. They're sabotaging. These create an exhausting cycle that depletes your energy and damages your well-being. By leaving instead of continuing this cycle, you freed yourself from the exhaustion. You're no longer organizing your emotional life around their patterns, no longer expending energy trying to maintain connection with someone who's withdrawing, no longer stuck in dynamic that kept you anxious and depleted. This freedom is profound because it allows your nervous system to regulate, allows your energy to be directed toward yourself and toward building life that serves you, rather than toward managing someone else's patterns. Your choice to leave means you taught them through experience that their patterns have real consequences that cannot be undone through their usual charm or manipulation. The avoidant likely believed they could always charm their way back in, could always manipulate your emotions to get another chance, could always work the dynamic to restore connection when they decided they wanted it. Your leaving without fighting, your maintenance of boundaries after leaving, your unavailability to their attempts to restore connection teaches them experientially that their patterns have consequences they cannot manipulate away. This is a powerful lesson that could potentially motivate genuine change if they choose to learn from it, and it also protects you because it means they cannot use their usual strategies to pull you back into dynamic that hurt you. Your choice to leave means you established yourself as a person with firm boundaries and high standards, attracting healthier future partners while repelling those who can't meet your standards. The strength demonstrated in leaving, the dignity maintained in your exit, the boundaries you established and maintained, these all communicate to potential future partners what kind of person you are and what your standards are. Healthy partners will be attracted to these qualities, will respect your boundaries, will appreciate that you have standards, and won't accept poor treatment. Unhealthy partners will be repelled, or will recognize they cannot manipulate someone with your strength and your boundaries. This filtering effect means your choice to leave with dignity sets you up for healthier future relationships because you've clearly communicated through your actions what you will and will not accept. Your choice to leave means you're no longer responsible for the avoidance feelings or their healing, freeing you from burden of managing their emotional state. When you were fighting for the relationship, trying to make it work, you were implicitly taking some responsibility for their patterns and their wounds, trying to create safety, trying to accommodate their limitations, trying to help them be better. By leaving, you ended this responsibility. Their feelings about the loss are theirs to manage. Their wounds are theirs to heal. Their patterns are theirs to address. You're free from the burden of trying to manage or fix someone else's psychological struggles, free to focus your energy on yourself, free from the exhausting role of being responsible for another adult's emotional well-being. Your choice to leave means you set precedent for yourself of choosing your well-being over relationship comfort, strengthening your capacity to enforce boundaries in future. Every time you enforce a boundary, every time you choose yourself over unhealthy relationship, you strengthen your capacity to do it again in future. Your choice to leave rather than fight for a relationship that wasn't serving you sets precedent for future decisions. You've proven to yourself that you can leave someone you care about when necessary for your well-being, that you can choose yourself over relationship comfort, that you can enforce ultimate boundary of complete removal when lesser boundaries aren't respected. This precedent makes future boundary enforcement easier because you have evidence of your capacity, proof that you can do what's necessary to protect yourself even when it's difficult. Your choice to leave ultimately means you're free to build life and relationships where fighting for basic respect isn't necessary because respect is freely given from the start. The most important implication of your choice is the future it opens. You're free now to pursue relationships where you don't have to fight to be treated well, where partners choose you clearly and consistently from the beginning, where your worth is recognized without you having to defend it, where the relationship enhances your life rather than depleting you. Your choice to leave rather than fight for someone who wasn't choosing you with their actions, regardless of their words, means you're available now for something better, For partner who doesn't just recognize your worth theoretically, but demonstrates that recognition through consistent loving presence. For relationship that doesn't require fighting or pursuing, but flows naturally from mutual desire and mutual respect. For partnership that adds to your life rather than requiring you to fight for its basic functioning. The avoidant is broken by your leaving, carrying that brokenness as their consequence and potentially as their teacher. And you move forward free, powerful, dignified, available for love that honors you rather than love that requires you to fight for what you deserve.